This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ACER, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. As you may have already heard me say, the ACER 2021 conference will be taking place online from the 30th of November to the 2nd of December this year. The theme is Flourishing Animals, and submissions are due by the 15th of September. That's submissions of individual papers and panel submissions. Take a look at the ACER website for the call for papers, and I hope to see you there. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. Lots of exciting things are taking place with the series, and you can get involved. The series is currently accepting proposals, so if you're working on a book about animal studies, you should consider reaching out to the series editors or Rogata Montoya at the press. Now, in July, I attended a virtual event put on by the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Centre called Cultures, Politics and Histories of Vegan Practice, where I met Dr. Catherine Oliver, who I'm very pleased to introduce you to today. Catherine is a geographer who works in the Department of Geography at the University of Cambridge, where she's working on a project called Urban Ecologies, Governing Non-Human Life in Global Cities. Today, we're going to talk about her book Veganism, Archives and Animals, Geographies of a Multi-Species World, which will be published by Routledge on the 13th of August this year, a few days after this podcast is released. Welcome to the podcast, Catherine.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
I started working on veganism in 2014 during my master's degree. And I'd become vegan the year before, and I'd become really, really passionate about thinking about veganism, thinking about animals. And I basically intended to do a PhD all about veganism and vegan activism in Britain, specifically in the West Midlands, actually, in my initial proposal. But then various things happened, as they tend to, during my PhD that totally changed my research trajectory. And the first one of those was an opportunity coming up at the British Library to work in the archives of animal activist Richard D. Ryder, who people will probably know from coining the term speciesism. So I then spent a long period of time in the archives thinking about the histories of animal activism, especially in Britain, but connected with other places in the world, particularly Australia and North America. So as I finished in the archives, I just so happened to be the timing. It was the exact same month. Me and my mum rescued 6 chickens from a hatchery. So the chickens were on the way from the hatchery to the egg farm when we adopted them, kind of intervened and adopted them. And so I started thinking more and more about, I guess in the archives, I'd felt really disconnected from animals. And so coming out and kind of getting to know these chickens who I'd met chickens before, but not in this way and not with all of this like new knowledge behind me. So it evolved, and in the midst of this, I was also interviewing vegans, vegan activists in Britain, across Britain, as well as kind of living with these chickens and reflecting on the archives. So yeah, it became this way more expansive project, bringing in all different ideas. And this inevitably, I guess, from the very beginning of my PhD, I wanted it to be a book. Like I always had in my mind that I want to write a book. So it was pretty easy to see where the book was coming from at the end of my PhD. It was kind of already there and fit this vision. So it's really exciting that it's coming out and get to talk about it. But yeah, the initial inspiration and the finished product, I mean, they're totally different things, really.
Now, in this book, you situate yourself within a few different subdisciplines of geography. You talk about animal geography, critical animal geography, and vegan geography. Could you introduce us to these different subfields?
Yeah, definitely. So I think geography has a long history of thinking about animals, of bringing animals into the discipline. And this goes back like over 100 years. So in Jennifer Walsh and Jodie Emmels' book, they talk about Newbigin's animal geography. But animals have often been seen as kind of part of the landscape, of part of the non-human world, but not as agents or actors. And so critical animal geographies kind of came around and troubled this and asked questions about how animals could be geographical actors, geographical interlocutors, political agents, and how they were part of the relations in space. And so vegan geographies kind of at the end of this, so there was this kind of trajectory of animal geographies and critical animal geographies critiquing more traditional animal geographies and bringing in those ideas of agency and politics. But vegan geographies is sort of, I guess, still newly emerging. I feel like it's still finding its feet and developing, and lots of more people thinking about vegan geographies and the difference between vegan geographies and critical animal geographies. And I guess some of this comes into that tension between, well, what's vegan studies and what's critical animal studies? What is it about veganism that's more than just animals or more than just food? And so vegan geographies is still developing, I think. It's still finding its way, but it's an interesting space that brings together animals, food, the environment, health, social movements, activism, and all these different things. But I still think it's very much in its infancy.
Yeah, fascinating. So perhaps up for grabs to a certain extent.
Definitely. I think so. I think this is one of the things that I was grappling with when I came to study veganism and animals, is that I guess even in the mainstream or the mainstreaming of veganism, in lots of ways, we've seen the kind of loss of animals as campaigns and people have focused on the health benefits, the environmental benefits, and all these things. Animals have kind of fallen to the back. So I know in my experience of moving through animal studies while studying veganism, before I started working with the chickens, I was kind of always felt a little bit out of place because I was once removed from the animals, like I wasn't working directly with animals. And obviously, when I started working with the chickens, I'd never intended to. It was kind of one of those happy coincidences of research and life coinciding. So I'd always felt a little bit out of place in animal studies, and kind of like I wasn't sure if I was meant to be there, because this veganism was a kind of once removed from the animals, and that was also supported by the narratives of environment and health that have come to dominate. And I think in the last year or so, we've seen animals move slightly back to the foreground, but maybe that's just my perspective and the kind of things that I see.
Yes, that's very interesting. So we'll hopefully get back to that in a little bit when we talk about the later parts of the book. But I thought it might be useful to to follow the book in order, as it were, and start with part one, which draws upon your work in the Ryder archive. So I know you briefly mentioned Ryder in your introduction, but could you just quickly introduce us to Richard Ryder and the contents of the archive?
Yeah, so Richard Ryder was an animal activist and he wore many, many hats. He was a psychologist, he was a writer, he's written many books on animals. I can't think of all the things he did, but he's one of these kind of traditional upper middle class gentlemen who's kind of worn so many hats. He served on the board of the RSPCA for a long time. I think he still sits on the board of the RSPCA. He was involved in the setting up of organisations like Compassion in World Farming and various other things. And so one of the, I guess probably the thing that most people know Ryder for is that he coined the term speciesism. And so in the 1970s, there was a group of philosophers based at Oxford, mainly Stanley Godlovich, Rosalind Godlovich, and John Harris. And so Robert Garner has just released a book on the Oxford group, actually, where way more detail, also from Ryder's archive.
Yes, we interviewed Rob Garner about that book on episode 160 of Knowing Animals. So if anyone's interested, they're very welcome to listen back to that.
Ryder was introduced to this group, by Bridget Brophy, who in 1965, I'm not always great at remembering dates, but I'm going to say it's 1965, wrote her essay, The Rights of Animals. And this kind of drew her attention from people like Ryder, and she introduced Ryder to the Oxford group. And later, and now I'm probably getting the order slightly wrong, but Peter Singer was also involved in the Oxford group in the 1970s. And so this group of people were working and thinking in Oxford. Many of them were PhD students in Oxford. And so they were talking about animal issues, they were talking about animal rights. And it was from this kind of group that things like, well, initially the first book to emerge was Animals, Men and Morals, which was published in 1971. That was edited by Stan, Rosalind Godlovich, and John Harris, and it featured essays from people like Bridget Brophy, Ruth Harrison. It was this book that had all these fascinating chapters in it, but it didn't really get a huge amount of attention, especially from a North American audience. It was kind of just came out and then that was it. And so Singer decided to review Animals, Men and Morals in the New York Review. And it was from this review that he really, his first ideas and his framework for animal liberation started to emerge. And as part of this, Ryder's version of the story goes, which I do kind of challenge a little bit in the book. Ryder's version of speciesism is that he was in the bath one day and he had this kind of eureka moment that the plight of animals, or the way that humans treat animals, was akin to the way, akin to racism, sexism, and all other kinds of oppressions. And this is where Ryder coined the term speciesism, then cited by, as I'm sure many listeners know, cited by Singer in Animal Liberation, where it kind of took on its new life. That's kind of an introduction to Ryder. And Ryder donated his archive to the British Library in 1999. And so when I arrived in 2016, the archive, which was arrived in like 3 tranches. So the first one had come off embargo in 2005. Then there was a second lot of materials pertaining to kind of later movements that came off embargo in 2015. And that took us up to kind of the late 80s, early 90s. And then all of his material after that, and he continued to add to the archive after he donated it. So he keeps adding stuff as and when he has it. And the rest of the archive is embargoed till 2025. And I'm just sort of realizing that's actually closer now. That date is closer than the 2015 material that I was working with. So yeah, it was uncatalogued. And so I was working as part of the British Library's placement scheme. And so I'd never done archival research before. And it was kind of very much thrown in at the deep end, because I became sort of a staff member at the British Library. I had a card and I worked in the basement. So I wasn't in the reading rooms, I was in the basements of the library. And I very much had free rein to go through this uncatalogued archive, which was absolutely fascinating because I got such a rich, detailed picture of Ryder's life and all of the kind of how things sat together and the way he'd organized things in his attic. And so now I believe that the archive is publicly accessible by appointment, but I think it's still largely uncatalogued. But yeah, it was absolutely filled with kind of the histories of animal activism across like organizational activism. So things like the RSPCA, things like the setting up of compassion in world farming, lots of kind of transnational setting up of chapters in different countries, such as RSPCA India. There's also all of the drafts and things of his book, the transcripts of his interviews. Yeah, I could go on, all of his letters, so many letters. I don't know how people have so much time to write. But yeah, it's an amazing archive. And certainly when it's publicly available, I think it will be, or more easily publicly available, I think it'll be an absolutely fantastic resource for scholars.
Good. Well, I was very struck by the fact that in the book you're actually fairly critical of Ryder, or at the very least, you're critical of the place that Ryder has in the legacy of animal activism. Is that a fair comment?
I think so. And I worry that I've been overly critical because I do really value what Ryder has done. And I really value the kind of trajectories and the wheels he's put in motion. But I think fundamentally there are some issues with the kind of activism that he promoted, the kind of ideas or the kind of erasures, particularly that the Oxford group through Ryder and Singer were creating. Yeah, and so when I was saying that Ryder's telling of the speciesism narrative is very interesting timing, because of course people like Carol Adams had been talking about the connections between misogyny and eating meat for a good 10 years before Ryder kind of came up with this eureka moment of speciesism. And with the kind of breadth and depth of reading and investment that he was putting into the animal movement, I find it difficult to believe that he wouldn't have been part of those conversations or been aware of those conversations, or if he wasn't, why not? And why is this not connected? And people like Carol Adams have spoken themselves about their these histories and the erasure of ecofeminist thought, particularly in the movement. And yeah, I think it was a difficult balance, because I do value what that group of people have done, and I think it is valuable and it's important. But some examples, such as, I'm pretty sure I quote it in the book, but he talks about how the previous generation of animal activists were kind of silly older women who needed to be, you needed to rationalize this movement, and you needed to present a sort of young, youthful, and masculine face to the movement in order for it to be taken seriously. And those kind of statements are, ones that I would find it hard not to be critical of. So I think I am critical, but hopefully not too much.
Yes, good. So I absolutely understand this concern about erasure, and I absolutely understand this concern about the dismissive comments about other activists. But you're also worried about the rationalist approach that people like Ryder and others in the Oxford group were adopting and were championing. Is that correct?
I don't think it's so much the approach per se, but the kind of attachment to that approach over any other approach. It was the kind of, this is the way, and this is the way we have to do it, and any other way is just not going to work, which I think is quite a difficult statement to make, and a difficult statement, certainly not as a philosopher, but as a geographer, and thinking from the kind of background that I have, to have that kind of rigidness to one approach to the expense of others is quite difficult for me to grapple with, and to say, it's an interesting tension, because I obviously don't disagree with their approach, and the kind of rationalist ideas, but I don't think it's the only way, and I think they were very dismissive of any other way, and tried very hard to, maybe unconsciously, to kind of write this particular history that erased other ideas and other ways of thinking and other ways of doing things, I guess.
Yes, that's very interesting, because it leads into part two of the book quite fruitfully. Because in part two, you're interviewing current vegan activists in the UK. And if I'm correct in my reading of what you're arguing, you're suggesting that many of them are rediscovering, or even if not rediscovering, at least feeling some affinity with the less rationalist approaches, the kind of eco-feminist approaches. So, for example, you talk about the idea of bodily connection with animals being central to veganism in the eyes of these activists. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, totally. So this was something that I found really interesting, because I thought there was going to be more in the interviews. I thought there was going to be more of the kind of drawing on animal rights and drawing on those histories. But actually, what was really interesting when I was talking to people was that I said to them, why did you become vegan? And so many, in fact, it came up in every interview, but I think one was people saying, oh, it just felt right. It was the truth. It was, once I knew the truth, this is what I had to do. I felt it in my gut. I had these kind of very visceral reactions to finding out about how animal agriculture treats animals. And there's one example in the book of a woman who's listening to Farmageddon as she drives to work, and she has to pull over because she's just so like physically, feels physically disgusted. And I think she says something like, I had to pull over the car as these waves of horror and waves of disgust just wash over me. And so I don't know that it was a particularly conscious eco-feminist connection, because when I talk to people about the histories of animal rights and the histories of veganism, people didn't really know much. Like they didn't have, or for most people, there wasn't a strong kind of grounding in theory or in rational ideas of justice, but it was very much just, I felt it was wrong. And so I've just actually got a paper coming out in the next couple of weeks where I get into this in kind of more detail, the stuff that didn't fit in the book, around feeling good in veganism and these ideas of how they feel truth and how truth is traveling through veganism in these really embodied ways. And one thing that I think was particularly interesting was we talked a lot about the body, or I talked a lot about the body and these embodied reactions discussed particularly in the interviews. But I also asked people how their relationship with animals has changed since they'd become vegan. And one thing that I picked up on was that most people, since becoming vegan, felt they had like less physical interactions with animals. They didn't see animals as much. If they didn't already have pets, they didn't have like huge amounts of interactions with animals, because they didn't feel like there was anywhere they could go and have those interactions. So some people had loved going to the zoo or petting farms, but obviously didn't want to go there once they'd become vegan, yet they felt like emotionally closer, like they understood animals better. They sort of shared this pain with animals. And I think this is where it comes to come back to Ryder. I think me and Ryder have some similar ideas around pain. So he was very invested in pain and this theory of painism that I don't think has been taken up that much in animal studies yet. Maybe its time is still to come. But he was very much interested in these ideas of pain and painism, but measuring pain particularly, and how we could decide who was in the most pain and how pain mattered. So he was far more interested, or he is far more interested in some of his books in pain over, for example, sentience. So this idea of pain did kind of read through it, this very embodied reaction, which I thought was interesting because that's not necessarily what I expected going into the interviews. I thought people would give me kind of reasons they went vegan, as if it was a rational decision. They kind of added up on one side the reasons to and against. But I don't know why I thought that, because that's not at all how I went vegan or how most people I know went vegan. It was really interesting. That was this resurgence, I guess, or maybe for the first time of the body moving away from a more rational animal rights of the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Yes, that's really fascinating. One of the other things that jumped out at me from these interviews was your discussion of a possible intergenerational conflict between vegans, or at least an intergenerational difference of view or opinion or worldview. What did you mean by that?
So this is something Roger Yates was talking about at the Vegan Sociology Conference last year, and he called it a battle for the heart of veganism. And I think there's much like feminism comes in various waves, and each generation has their own issues. I think veganism has morphed over the last almost century of British organisational veganism, from something that was very concerned with spirituality as well as animals and the environment in the 40s when it was kind of founded, through this kind of animal rights focus, this real focus on justice and these kind of ethical frameworks of arguing what is right and what is just, through to this kind of embodied veganism, which there isn't necessarily, people don't even necessarily feel a need to root it in a sense of kind of framework of rights. It's just what feels right and what feels wrong. Oh, it's the truth, it comes back to this idea of people saying, well, it's the truth. I don't know what you want me to say. This is just the truth. This is the truth of how we should live in the world. It's wrong to do this. There's kind of a much more a connection to emotion and sentimentality, which was always dismissed, or which was dismissed in the kind of 70s. From the 70s movement of animal rights. It was that kind of removal of, let's take out emotion and sentimentality. Let's make sure that there's just no way that people can argue against it, sort of, to a position of, well, do we need to argue? We know what's right. We know what's right and what's wrong. And I wonder if some of this comes with the changes in tactics, I guess, activist strategies, and the opening of the online space. That there's something different going on with the activism, the kind of activism, the kind of exposure that people can get now to veganism, where the picture of the vegan has changed a lot in the last 40 years, from something on the fringe, something extreme, to very much front and center as a way of life that anyone could participate in for any reason.
In part 3 of the book, you reflect upon your relationship with the chickens, who you mentioned earlier. Could you explain how your relationship with these chickens and how the ethnographic work exploring this relationship was connected, or is connected, with the more typically scholarly approaches of the archival research of part 1 and the interview-based research of part 2 of the book?
When I came out of the archives, I felt very distant from animals, and very like I hadn't really centered animals in the research. It was very much about activism and about these histories of the movement, which is obviously very interesting, but I'd really felt I'd lost something. And so in the first part of the book, I talk a lot about friendship and how friendship has played its role in establishing networks of power and networks of resistance in animal activist histories. And then in part 2 of the book, I talked a lot about truth and how activists today were navigating truth in their veganism and in their activism. So in part 3 of the book, I moved to animals basically because I feel like in the rest of the book there aren't many animals. And so part 3 is different. It's the most experimental part of the book, but I do like it, and it connects kind of this work to the work that I'm doing now with chickens. So chickens are an animal who are often not really thought of as an animal. They're often not thought of as a bird. They're thought of as food. They're thought of as producers. And I was very lucky that I got to live with these animals, and they totally challenged kind of the very humanist methods and the human-centered, anthropocentric research that I've been doing up until this point. And so I spent many, many months with these chickens and kind of caring for them, visiting them, watching them, trying to learn about them. And testing some of these ideas of can you be, how far can you extend friendship? Can you be friends with animals? How can this relationship with chickens be disruptive to other ideas, to their traditional place in society and their traditional distance, their traditional spatial distance from humans? And I think this sort of responds to some kind of questions or conversations in animal studies around, well, what does the future look like? What does the future look like after veganism? If we all become vegan, what does the future look like? And so the chickens really challenged actually my own views on veganism. And I think I talk a little bit about in the book how before I met the chickens, I just sort of thought of them as almost instrumental to making a point about veganism. And I had never really, which I feel sort of bad admitting this, but I'd never really thought about chickens as a bird, about what chickens might want. And ultimately, all of the people from the histories of animal activism, whatever our differences, whatever our differences in opinion, in theory, in method, and all the people I interviewed, ultimately what we want is a world where these chickens aren't being farmed in the way that they are, where these chickens and other animals are able to live in harmony, community, in a multi-species world where there isn't that kind of hierarchy of beings. And so this chapter really challenged everything I'd thought about up to this point, because I met the chickens and I sort of realized that I'd been thinking about them in a way that didn't do them justice. I didn't know them. I didn't really know anything about them. I'd never really thought about what they might like or what our world might look like if we lived together. And so I see this last bit of the book as really about what that world might look like, some of the mistakes I made, how this kind of changed. And it is a kind of different approach, a different way of writing, a different way of experimenting with some of these ideas around animals. But I hope that it also brings the whole book to a close on that ultimately all of us, we are working towards this, and what might this look like? How do we turn to the future, as well as kind of grapple with our past and our presence, and how the movement's changing? Where does this all lead to?
Great. I mean, that feels like a very positive note on which to end this part of the conversation. So I'd like to move on to our 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am. I feel like I need to be quick. I'm ready though.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I can. It was, and I feel very fortunate that this was my route into animal scholarship. It was Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat, which I read in 2014, and totally changed my trajectory, the trajectory of my life.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I can. It was during my undergraduate degree. It was an essay for a course on mediated geography, which was run by my later to be PhD supervisor, Pat Noxolo. This would have been 2013. So I'd recently become vegan. And in this essay, I was comparing Earthlings, the film, which I'm sure many people have heard of, with vegan Facebook groups at the time who had banned, quote marks, vegan propaganda. So you weren't allowed to talk about kind of vegan ethics and vegan philosophies. And I was comparing these two types of media. And actually, I just had a quick look at it, and there's lots of interesting ideas in there about, I thought it was going to be awful, but there was lots of ideas about bodies in there that I still have in my work now.
Oh, good. So you can trace that continuity from the very earliest work.
Yeah, it's really weird.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
So I've been thinking about this, and this is something I found quite difficult to answer because so many people in the animal studies community have been so supportive, so welcoming. It's just a great community. Obviously, I can't name them all. And I didn't do my PhD with animal studies supervisors, so I often felt quite left out of the animal studies community. But in 2019, I was invited to attend this summer school in Kassel in Germany. And there I met my now friend, Zoe Sutton, who's currently based at Flinders University in Australia. And we immediately clicked and spent the whole week together talking about critical animal studies and all these ideas. And she does fantastic work on critical animal scholarship on dogs. And she's really incisive and sharp in her thinking. But she's also committed to like wider issues in higher education around neoliberalism, precarity. And I thought I wanted to use this space to really emphasize how impactful relationships with my peers have been in doing this work. So as valuable as my mentoring or intergenerational relationships have been, actually the transformative impact has been through my peer friendships, not only for my work, but for my general happiness and enjoyment of my work as well.
Yes, thanks for sharing that. What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
These quick fire questions are really hard. I feel like I'm being very having to be very quick. So I think the most important thing that academics can do for animals is to really get to know their animal subjects the animals they work with as a species, a breed, as individuals, and as communities, really, really closely and sort of intensely. So for my current work on chickens, I'm trawling through like medical, agricultural knowledge, lots of which I find incredibly violent. But if I can read and learn everything I can about chickens, I feel like I'm in the best place I can to do this work. And so people in the chicken world, at least, that are doing this really fantastically are people like Karen Davis, Justin Van Cleek, and Mary Britton Klaus. And I feel like that real intense, deep knowledge about animals, not just the surface level knowledge, everything, as far as we can, is really important to thinking about animals, talking about animals, and well, pardon the expression, but knowing animals, is where I think the is really valuable.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human, non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I think ultimately for me, it kind of boils down to a more expansive change, totally obliterating kind of colonial capitalist frameworks that we're all implicated in. One aspect of the human, non-human animal relationship I'm increasingly angry about is the community that so many of us across the world are denied a community with animals. For people in precarious housing employment, displaced people, poor people, transient people, we're denied the ability to live with animals, and animals are denied the ability to live with one another and with humans if they so choose. And I feel like on the trajectory we're going, that might always be the case. And so if I could change something, it would be that animals and humans would be able to live in community with each other.
What are you working on next?
So I'm working on lots and lots and lots of things about chickens. Basically, I've just started the fieldwork, or the next phase of fieldwork for my postdoc, which is looking at urban chickens in London. So I'm now travelling back and forth to London to meet lots of chickens in lots of interesting places. I've just spent several months interviewing chicken keepers in London as well. So I'm currently writing up various things about chickens. One about chicken coops in London, the history of chicken coops in London. One about the current kind of contemporary chicken keepers, how they have relationships with other animals in their gardens, so not just chickens, but also foxes, rats, and waterfowl, particularly because we had avian flu. So I'm doing lots of interesting chicken stuff and hoping to continue doing more for the next couple of years at least.
And how can people find out more about your work?
So I have a website where I post blogs and essays on the things I'm thinking about, as well as talks and upcoming events. That's katherineCMOliver.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Katie, Katie CM Oliver.
Well, thanks, Catherine, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really fun.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, or on Instagram, if you want to see lots of pictures of my vegetables, at A Vegan Philosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes or wherever you found us. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.